Charleston keeps its secrets in ledgers, ink dark, leather-bound, stacked like tombstones. In 1847, the clerks at Ryan's Mart turned pages with the same dispassion a butcher brings to scales. Weight, complexion, teeth, price. One more life appraised and recorded. Yet on April 14, someone's hand hesitated. The line for lot 47, the young female domestic called Grace, looked neat from a distance, but the closer you leaned, the more the page seemed to argue with itself. The word female shone a touch too black, as if the pen had been dipped again. The loops a little nervous, the angle not matching the rest of the clerk's script. Beside it, a physician's certification bore a name that was common enough to hide behind Marcus Waverley, and a signature whose firmness felt strangely practiced, like a copied flourish learned by memory instead of habit. Auctioneer Samuel Pritchard noticed none of this, or pretended he didn't. He wore the bored authority of a man who sold hope and despair by the dozen. A healthy housegirl, he sang to the room. Trained hands, a light touch, reads letters, knows a lady's wardrobe. Buyers pressed forward through heat and musk, the air salted with tobacco and the sour press of fear. The nice fiction in places like Ryan's was that dignity still counted. Slaves stood straighter when told to, they turned when directed. They answered questions as if their answers mattered. The gavel would come down, and the fiction would end. Thomas Vanderhorst took a middle place in the crowd. He told his older brother Isaiah he could handle this purchase, and it pleased him to be needed. Richmond had made him social, quick with laughter, confident in rooms that smelled of port and pipe ash. In this hall, though, he forced himself to watch with a cooler eye. Teeth, wrists, the silent stories told by posture. When Grace stepped up, her eyes stayed low. Her dress was faded blue with careful mending at the hem. Her hands looked fine, boned, less farm, more house. When the auctioneer asked her to speak, her voice rose small and clear, the low-country cadence tethered tightly to perfect grammar. She could keep a linen press in order. She could brew restorative teas. She could read scripture aloud and cipher simple accounts. Each claim stroked the room like a gloved hand, polite, practiced, reassuring. Health, a buyer called. Pritchard thumped the certificate. Sound in body and mind. No consumption, no dropsy, no female complaints. The last phrase earned small nods. In markets where people were priced for labor and reproduction alike, even euphemism had teeth. The bidding began at 400. It slid briskly up like a temperature. Thomas waited, counting the money in his coat and the expectations in his head. He had a letter from Isaiah folded against his chest with strict requirements. A domestic servant literate if possible for Catherine, the new wife who needed order more than finery. At 725, a planter with rice stains at his cuffs paused. Thomas lifted his chin. 750. The gavel's crack was almost kind. The clerk's table smelled of iron gall and wax. Paper slid forward, and the clerk wrote with the fatigue of a man who had already written 100 names today. Thomas watched out of habit but not suspicion. Few men examined the shape of letters when the shape of a human life was standing just yards away. He signed, feeling clever for coming under Isaiah's budget by $50 if one ignored the travel and tips he'd never mention. Grace was led down from the platform, a small bundle of belongings handed to her, a comb, a spare dress, a thin Bible. She followed Thomas at the right distance, never too close, never careless. If he noticed the carefulness with which she stepped, the way her shoulders arranged themselves as if always in a portrait, he told himself Charleston had trained a certain kind of modesty into house servants. That thought was easy. Easy always feels true. Night in Charleston came warm and restless. In his waterfront room, Thomas wrote to Isaiah with cheerful precision. He described the girl's manners, her literacy, the sense that she spoke like someone who had been in quiet rooms and learned not to thud drawers or clatter plates. He mentioned the price with a salesman's pride and folded the letter around the glow of his own satisfaction. Outside, a ship's bell tolled. Men shouted softly in the harbor. The city clicked its night gears forward. In Ryan's Mart, the floor was washed. Ink dried. A day's economy ended. At dawn, the road took them. Coach to Wilmington, packet boat up the coast, then overland again through country that went from salt to pine to tobacco's dull green. The journey made Grace a shadow that moved when moved. She ate little. When Thomas granted her a cup of coffee at a station, she cradled it like heat itself were a gift. In the rough, segregated rooms where the enslaved slept, she sat awake for long minutes after the others collapsed, her gaze fixed on nothing, as if she were listening for a sound only she could hear. Thomas saw none of this or saw it, and filed it under quiet temperament. He did notice she never asked for anything. That, to him, was another point in her favor. When he studied her face on the second day, purely to reassure himself he'd chosen well, he was struck by a thought he couldn't place, a theatricality that wasn't artifice so much as discipline. She occupied the space of a woman, the way an expert occupies a role, hitting marks with care, never overplaying the scene. The idea felt uncharitable. He wasn't a cruel man, so he dismissed it as the ugly tendency of observers to invent difficulty where need alone would suffice as explanation. Poverty trains its own graceless grace. He let the thought go. The Virginia border never announces itself properly. It simply insists. The roads hardened, the distances widened, and at last Riverwood's trees began to rise, those old oaks speaking the plain truth of money and time. The main house stood with its cream-worn columns and sun-battered porch, a face that had once smiled wide and now regarded visitors with a kind of stern courtesy. Isaiah waited at the top of the steps, his height and posture arranged into welcome only by effort. He looked at Grace, and whatever he meant to see, usefulness, economy, a tool well chosen, he kept to himself. "Suitable," he said, and the word fell with the heaviness of judgment. "Catherine will assess." Patience, the housekeeper, came forward, a woman whose gaze could gather a person into sense without a word. She took Grace toward the side door, the servant's entrance that made sure lines stayed lines. It is a terrible skill to vanish yourself well. In the attic quarters, Grace placed her bundle under a narrow bed, the kind of bed that makes a body careful or broken. She learned the geography instantly. Stairs that creaked, a board near the window that took weight badly, the smell of pressed herbs in a cupboard where patients stored quiet cures for headaches that doctors called nerves. She offered her hands to the kitchen, to coal and lint and lye soap. If anyone studied her too long, Lily did. Once, with sharp curiosity, Grace lowered her eyes in that Charleston-trained way that explained itself without speaking. "I am here to be useful, and nothing more." Catherine met her the next morning, not in a gracious parlor, but in the small sitting room off the mistress's bedchamber, where life actually happened. The mistress had a face intelligent enough to betray what it noticed. She worked to smooth that away. "You were trained in Charleston?" Catherine asked, and the neutrality of her tone was a courtesy offered to herself as much as to the girl. Grace answered as she had been taught, soft, precise, unimpeachable. The comb and irons lay ready. "Show me," Catherine said. For 20 minutes, the air filled with the quick, controlled music of hair turned by practiced hands. A woman can tell when another woman has learned to be invisible. Catherine felt that like a draft in a closed room, the way Grace's breath never came loud, the way she stepped back not half a pace, but exactly the fraction that would satisfy and not read as retreat. If there was something studied in it all, a costume worn for survival that only made sense. The world at Riverwood was made of costumes. Even Catherine knew she wore one. By noon, the house had taken Grace's measure. She did not break china. She didn't forget that Isaiah disliked doors left ajar. She knew how to read a Bible verse without putting herself inside the verse. When Catherine left a dull novel open on a table and returned to find her servant's lips moving silently over the line, she noticed but didn't correct. "You like stories?" she asked, the way someone speaks through a closed door to see if it opens. Grace started to apologize by reflex. "I asked a question," Catherine said softly. "Yes, mistress," Grace answered. "I do." Under the shape of routine, Riverwood hummed like a hive. Men in the fields, account books breathing their slow arithmetic, evenings on the porch where Isaiah smoked and stared at horizons as if history were waiting there to be reworked. Somewhere inside that hum lay the moment everything would tilt, the gavel's echo traveling late across distance, but in these first days, the house pretended it didn't know its future. That is another of history's cruelties, how convincingly it stages innocence right up until it cannot. On the 5th day, Thomas prepared to leave. He walked the porch with Isaiah, receiving the thanks older brothers give younger ones by custom rather than warmth. "She'll do," Isaiah said. Catherine needs order. Thomas nodded, pleased to be useful, ready to be gone. Before he mounted, he glanced back once. Through the side window, he saw Catherine seated and the new girl standing a careful distance behind, hands folded, waiting for the next instruction. It struck him as a well-framed tableau, wealth and service balanced neatly, the story of a plantation told without any need for words. He carried that picture away like proof he'd done right. Behind glass, Catherine looked at the girl's reflection, a sliver in the window pane, two figures overlaid by sky, and felt, for a heartbeat, a tug she couldn't name. Not desire, not yet. Something gentler and more treacherous. Recognition. A woman who knew how to perform the role given to her. A woman who understood that roles, when worn too long, become cages. The ledger in Charleston was already turning brittle at the corners. Ink was drying into the permanence that would one day mislead. Under the word female, a darker letter waited like a seed. Under Riverwood's orderly breakfast trays, something small and inevitable began to move. The gavel had fallen days ago, but only now did its sound arrive soft through miles, unmistakable in meaning. A sale is never really over when fraud has been built into the price. And the truth, once purchased, will always find a way to collect. The year was 1847, and the spring light in Hanover County made everything look deceptively gentle. The tobacco fields shimmered a pale green, the air smelled of tilled soil and new money, and the James River drifted by with the same steady patience that had carried flatboats of cured leaf for generations. On paper, Hanover was thriving. In spirit, it was holding its breath. At the center of that uneasy calm stood Riverwood Plantation, an 800-acre inheritance of oaks, labor, and ghosts. Built in 1798 by the first Vanderhorst patriarch, the house wore its years like a face that refused to smile. White columns weathered to cream, shutters once black now dulled to ash, and a porch that seemed too wide for the silence it held. Visitors remarked on its dignity, locals whispered about its loneliness. Its master, Isaiah Vanderhorst, was 43 and carved from the same solemn timber as the house itself. He had been handsome, once tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who filled a doorway, but grief had drawn his skin tighter and his temper thinner. His first wife, Sarah, had died 3 years earlier after a fever that came with childbirth and took both mother and child within a week. Her room upstairs had become a shrine. No one entered it except to dust, and even that was done under his watchful eye. The hairbrush still lay on the vanity, the embroidered sampler still hung half-finished in its frame. Since Sarah's death, Riverwood had changed tempo. The laughter of guests had vanished. Isaiah stopped hosting dinners. Even the dogs learned to move quietly. The enslaved men and women who worked the property, 43 souls in all, spoke of their master with the respectful caution reserved for thunderclouds. Distant admiration mixed with the knowledge that lightning could strike without warning. Only one person in the house dared to treat Isaiah as the boy she remembered. Patience, an elderly woman who had served as midwife, cook, and conscience since before he was born. She carried her authority the way older slaves sometimes did, with a steadiness that even masters respected. Patience saw the hollowness in Isaiah's eyes, the weight of something unspoken pressing him inward. She said nothing. In a house ruled by silence, wisdom often meant survival. Isaiah's younger brother Thomas visited quarterly from Richmond, all conversation and cologne, as different from Isaiah as summer from winter. Where Isaiah's voice was gravel, Thomas's was music. He managed the business of tobacco exports, knew everyone worth knowing, and measured success in handshakes rather than harvests. The brothers met for ledgers, not affection. By early March, even Thomas had begun pressing Isaiah to remarry. "You need an heir," he'd said over brandy one evening, the fire snapping like punctuation. "A house without children turns into a museum, and you're too young to start curating ghosts." Isaiah had stared into his glass. "You think a new wife will make me whole?" "No," Thomas said, not unkindly, "but she'll make the neighbors stop asking questions." The questions were practical. Who would inherit Riverwood? What would become of its fields and people? In the South, legacy wasn't just sentiment, it was business. Without an heir, property scattered, names faded, and fortunes slipped quietly into other families' pockets. His mother, Constance, widowed but formidable, decided to intervene. From her parlor in Richmond, she wrote letters, endless letters, to friends, cousins, and former debutantes, searching for a woman of breeding, health, and pliant disposition. Beauty was optional, fertility was not. She found one in Catherine Shelby, 26, educated, genteel, and most importantly, available. The Shelbys had once been proud landowners in Albemarle County, but after Catherine's father's death, debts swallowed most of what remained. Catherine lived in a small house with her widowed mother, teaching the children of neighbors to read. She had delicate hands, an intelligent face, and a manner described by one acquaintance as more book than ballroom. When Constance's proposal arrived, marriage to a stable, respectable widower, master of an established estate, she accepted with quiet resignation. They were married on the 16th of March, 1847, in a ceremony so small that half the pews of St. Paul's Church stood empty. Catherine wore a simple ivory dress trimmed with lace that had yellowed slightly from storage. Isaiah gave her a ring that had belonged to Sarah. It fit perfectly, though it had never been sized for her. When the carriage turned onto Riverwood's Drive that afternoon, Catherine pressed her gloved hand to the window glass. The house loomed ahead like a verdict. Its beauty was undeniable, but so was its melancholy. "Welcome home," Isaiah said beside her, and the phrase landed like a duty, not an invitation. She arrived with 2 trunks and a companion, Dinah, a free woman of color who had served her family for a decade and whom her mother insisted accompany her for safety and propriety. Isaiah tolerated the arrangement reluctantly. "She may have a room, and I'll see that she's paid a wage," he said, "but there'll be no indulgence. Riverwood runs lean." Inside, the servants lined the hall, bowing slightly, their expressions cautious. Patience studied the new mistress as one might examine a fragile piece of china, beautiful but easily broken. Catherine offered a polite smile that went unanswered. In a house that had buried one mistress, loyalty was not transferable. The days that followed unfolded with a kind of formal politeness that felt like exile. Isaiah kept to his study or the fields. Catherine kept to the rooms assigned to her. The plantation's rhythm ran like a machine that neither welcomed nor required her. Meals were quiet. Conversation, when it happened, revolved around weather, crops, and accounts. At night, Isaiah came to her bed at irregular intervals. He performed his duties with mechanical precision, as if reproduction were a business obligation. He seldom spoke. When he did, it was to ask if she was comfortable, not if she was content. Catherine learned to answer both questions the same way, with a small, practiced nod. Loneliness arrived quickly. In Albemarle, even poverty had allowed her the comfort of friendship, church socials, the hum of other voices. At Riverwood, silence was its own inhabitant. She spent afternoons reading in the small sitting room adjacent to her chamber, where the light fell in through lace curtains and dust drifted like memory. Sometimes she walked the gardens, though Isaiah disapproved of her doing so unaccompanied. It was Dinah who first whispered the obvious, "You need someone else, miss. Another pair of hands. I can't be everywhere." Catherine hesitated. Asking for more servants felt indulgent when she had so little affection from her husband. Yet practical necessity gave her courage. One evening at dinner, she raised the subject carefully, choosing words like stepping stones across a river. "The household is large, Isaiah. Dinah manages my personal things, but certain duties, laundry, sewing, correspondence." He interrupted, not unkindly but weary. "Patience manages the house." "She manages it for you," Catherine said, then stopped, afraid she'd said too much. Isaiah looked at her for the first time that night. His eyes were the color of a storm waiting for lightning. After a moment he nodded. "I'll see to it." And that was that. The decision would ripple outward through Charleston's slave market, through the ink of forged papers, through miles of road, and into Catherine's quiet sitting room. She could not have known then that the simple act of requesting help would set into motion the tragedy that would destroy them all. For now, she closed her diary each night with a neat flourish and wrote small, careful prayers in the margins, prayers for peace, for purpose, for the ability to belong in a place that did not yet recognize her as living. Downstairs, Patience stirred the coals in the kitchen hearth and murmured to herself, "Every house keeps a secret. It's just a matter of who finds it first." Outside, the spring wind lifted through the tobacco rows, whispering across Riverwood's old fields like a warning no one thought to hear. The letter from Richmond arrived on a rain-soaked afternoon, its paper stiff with humidity, and the ink smudged where Thomas's pen had lingered too long. Isaiah read it at his desk beneath the gaze of his father's portrait, the oil-dark eyes seeming to demand constant prudence. Thomas wrote in his brisk, affable style, polite but proud, "Brother, I believe I've found what you require. The girl's name is Grace, literate, well-mannered, trained in the domestic arts, and of sound health. Purchased at Ryan's Mart for $750, slightly above your limit, but I judged her quality worth it. I trust she'll serve Catherine well." Isaiah folded the letter neatly, neither smiling nor frowning. Money spent was money gone. Efficiency mattered more than gratitude. He rang for Patience and handed her the note. "See that quarters are arranged in the attic with the other house staff," he said. "She'll arrive by week's end." Patience read the signature and the figure at the bottom with pursed lips. "From Charleston?" she asked softly. "Yes." Her silence lasted just long enough to make Isaiah look up. "You disapprove?" She shook her head. "No, sir. Just that Charleston folk come with a certain polish and a certain mystery, hard to tell which will wear off first." Isaiah frowned. "We're not buying philosophy, Patience. We're buying labor." By the time the carriage carrying Thomas and Grace reached Riverwood, the April air had grown heavy with approaching thunder. Mud clung to the wheels, and the horse's flanks gleamed with sweat. Thomas stepped down first, his grey travel coat streaked with road dust. Grace followed, small and self-contained, her bundle pressed to her chest. From the porch, Isaiah watched their approach like a man studying new furniture, appraising, not greeting. He was struck by her stillness. She didn't shuffle, didn't meet anyone's gaze, simply waited for instruction. She was, as Thomas had promised, refined though, in a way that seemed studied rather than natural. "She seems suitable," Isaiah said finally, then turned toward the house. "Patience will see her settled." As Patience led Grace away, the first low growl of thunder rolled across the fields. In that sound lay something prophetic, though no one yet recognized it. Grace's first impression of Riverwood was of weight in the air, in the eyes that followed her, in the expectation that everything here was already known, and had no room for her to exist beyond function. The hallway smelled faintly of soap, tobacco, and absence. Portraits of stern men stared down from gilt frames. The floorboards creaked under her soft steps, and she noted without allowing herself to react that every sound in this house would betray her if she wasn't careful. Patience showed her the attic quarters, 3 narrow beds, a single window overlooking the back fields, and the distant scent of rain leaking through the roof beams. "You'll share with Lily and Hannah," she said. "Keep to your corner. Mornings start before dawn. Mistress Catherine likes her fires lit early." "Yes, ma'am," Grace whispered. Patience studied her face, those fine bones, the nervous precision of her gestures. "You from Charleston, child?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you know how to hold your tongue and your posture. Keep both steady, and you'll last here." Patience left her with a candle stub and a warning glance that was half sympathy, half prophecy. Grace unpacked her small bundle, the spare dress, the Bible, the comb. She smoothed the fabric, then ran her hand over the page edges of the book, not to read, but to remind herself of order, of control. For 17 years she had lived inside an illusion so perfect it had become armor. Each morning she fastened that armor one layer at a time, binding, dress, manner, voice. Her mother's voice whispered in memory, "Walk softly, child. The world won't forgive you for being in between." At Riverwood, the performance would need to be flawless. The next morning, she met Catherine Vanderhorst. The mistress sat in the small sitting room beside her bedchamber, a room scented with lavender and restraint. Sunlight fell across her hair, a dark, chestnut shade that caught red glints near the window. Catherine's beauty was the quiet kind, the kind that seemed to apologize for itself. Grace stood in the doorway until Catherine motioned her closer. "You were trained in Charleston?" "Yes, mistress." "You can sew, dress hair, manage linens?" "Yes, mistress." "Show me," Catherine said, gesturing to the vanity table. Grace moved with practiced economy. She took a brush from the table, separated a section of hair, and began to work. Her fingers were gentle but deliberate, combing with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. She said nothing unless asked. She made no eye contact. Catherine watched her reflection in the mirror. What she saw wasn't just obedience, it was something closer to deliberation. Every motion controlled, every breath measured. A woman performing femininity with the precision of someone who had learned it, not inherited it. When Grace finished, Catherine lifted her hand to touch the smooth twist at her nape. "You're skilled," she said softly. "Thank you, mistress. Where did you learn?" "From my former mistress, Mrs. Gadsden of Charleston. She taught you to read?" "Yes, mistress. I read from the Bible for her in the evenings." Catherine hesitated, then nodded. "That will be useful." She dismissed Grace with a quiet, "That will do," but her eyes followed the girl as she left the room. There was something about her, something Catherine couldn't yet name. Not defiance, not exactly humility either. Something quieter, heavier, like a person walking carefully across thin ice. Downstairs, Isaiah asked Patience how the new servant performed. "Fine hands," she said. "Knows her place. Too quiet, maybe." "Too quiet?" Isaiah looked up from his account book. Patience shrugged. "Quiet people carry loud secrets. But that's your affair, not mine." Isaiah dismissed her with a wave, but later, when he walked past the parlor and saw Grace kneeling by the hearth, polishing the andirons until they reflected her blurred face, he caught himself watching her longer than was necessary. Something about the way she kept her eyes averted made him uneasy, as if she were not avoiding his gaze out of fear but out of calculation. In the attic that night, Grace lay awake listening to the sounds of the house. Boards settling, footsteps crossing the hall below, the low murmur of Isaiah's voice behind closed doors. Hannah snored softly beside her. Rain drummed against the roof, and through a crack in the boards, the moon painted a thin white line across the floor. Grace turned her face toward it and whispered the same prayer she had whispered every night since Charleston. Let them see what they expect to see. Downstairs, Catherine sat at her dressing table, brushing out her hair where Grace's hands had been. For the first time since her marriage, she felt another presence in the house that didn't belong to Isaiah, a quiet energy that seemed to breathe against the stillness of the walls. She didn't yet know if it comforted or frightened her. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer now, echoing across the fields like a warning no one wanted to interpret. The rain would pass by morning, and Riverwood would return to its measured quiet. But in that quiet, something fragile and forbidden had already begun to stir, something that would one day demand to be heard. In the weeks that followed, Riverwood settled into a pattern that looked calm from the outside and trembled underneath. The spring heat thickened, cicadas began their slow metallic hymn, and the air grew so heavy it made even conversation feel like labor. Catherine's world narrowed to the main house, the same corridors, the same faces, the same routine stitched tight as a corset. Every morning, Grace arrived at her mistress's chamber before dawn. She lit the fire, aired the linens, and laid out the day's dress with the precision of someone arranging evidence. Her movements were so silent that Catherine once remarked, half to herself, "You move like smoke." Grace paused, unsure if it was praise or suspicion. "I try not to disturb, mistress." "Disturbance," Catherine said softly, "is sometimes the only way we know something's alive." It was a strange remark, the sort that might have invited correction from any other lady of Virginia, but Catherine said it as though she were talking to herself, and Grace knew enough to leave silence in its place. Afternoons were the hardest. The heat slowed everything to a daze, and the hours stretched long and airless. Catherine sat near the window, reading, though she rarely turned the pages. It was during one such afternoon that she discovered Grace could read more than the Bible. Catherine had left a novel, Ivanhoe, by Walter Scott, open on her side table. When she returned from the garden, she found Grace standing beside it, her lips moving in a whisper of sound. Her posture froze when she realized she was being watched. "Do you like stories?" Catherine asked. Grace dropped instantly into her careful stance. "I'm sorry, mistress. I shouldn't have touched it." "I didn't ask if you were sorry," Catherine said. "I asked if you like stories." A pause, then, very softly, "Yes, mistress." Catherine studied her, then read to me, "Since you've already begun." Grace hesitated. She knew the risk. A mispronounced word could be seen as insolence, too much fluency as presumption, but Catherine's tone carried no threat, only fatigue. Grace picked up the book, turned the page, and began to read. Her voice was quiet but distinct, a Charleston cadence smoothed by years of restraint. The words came alive in that dim room. Catherine closed her eyes, letting the rhythm pull her out of the walls that confined her. When the chapter ended, she said, "Again tomorrow." So it began their daily ritual. Each afternoon, while Isaiah rode the fields or studied ledgers in his office, the two women sat together behind a closed door. Catherine reclined on the chaise. Grace read aloud. The sounds of plantation life, murmuring slaves, the groan of wagons, the crack of distant whips blurred into a background hum, distant and unreal. They moved from Ivanhoe to Shakespeare's comedies, then to poetry, Byron, Shelley, Keats. Grace read with an earnestness that made even trite verses ache with feeling. Sometimes Catherine interrupted to ask about a word. Sometimes she just watched Grace's lips move, the sunlight catching the edge of her cheek. Once, when Grace stumbled over a line, Catherine smiled. "Even you can't make sense of his metaphors, it seems." Grace allowed herself a tiny smile back. "No, mistress, but I reckon sometimes sense isn't the point." The moment hung between them, a single, dangerous beat of familiarity. Then both women looked away, pretending it hadn't happened. Outside that room, the house whispered. Dinah, practical as ever, saw the hours Grace spent upstairs and didn't like the pattern. She approached Catherine one morning, voice low but firm. "Mistress, may I speak plain?" "You usually do. It's about that girl. You and her spend a lot of time alone. Folks notice." Catherine's tone cooled. "And what do they imagine happens in those hours, Dinah? That I'm plotting the downfall of Hanover County with a servant? No, ma'am, but this house has its ways, and its master has eyes. I just don't want you hurt by how things might look." Catherine turned back to her mirror. "Appearance is the one luxury I can no longer afford to care about." That ended the conversation, but not the unease. If Grace sensed the scrutiny, she gave no sign. Yet at night, in the attic, she tied her bindings tighter, as if the cords could hold her secret more securely. She washed her small cloths in silence, dried them by candlelight, and rehearsed her disguise in the mirror's warped reflection. Every night, before sleeping, she whispered the same mantra. "Remember who they think you are. Forget who you are when they're watching." But memory is treacherous, and loneliness turns strangers into mirrors. By late May, Catherine had begun speaking freely during their readings, her voice carrying the weary intimacy of someone confessing to a diary. She spoke of her mother, of Albemarle's gentle hills, of the suitor she might have married if not for her family's debts. Grace listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally offering a small murmur of sympathy that wasn't quite servile. One afternoon, Catherine said quietly, "Do you ever wish to be free?" Grace froze. Questions like that could be traps. She measured her words carefully. "Freedom looks different depending on where you stand, mistress." Catherine turned her head. "And where do you stand, Grace?" "In your service," Grace said, voice steady but eyes lowered. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. Her husband had come to her room briefly, as he sometimes did, without tenderness or malice, simply duty fulfilled in the dark. After he left, she sat awake, the echo of Grace's voice haunting her more than Isaiah's touch. The boundary between mistress and servant began to thin, almost imperceptibly. A glance held too long in the mirror, a hand resting a moment longer than necessary while fastening a dress. Catherine told herself it was nothing more than gratitude, the comfort of another soul in an empty house. Grace told herself she was cultivating protection, ensuring favor in a world where exposure meant ruin. But their hearts didn't believe their minds. By June, their reading sessions had become something sacred. Grace's voice softened. Catherine's laughter returned. When the story ended, neither woman moved for long moments, suspended in the fragile peace that existed only in that room. Once, Catherine brushed a loose wisp of hair from Grace's forehead. Her fingers lingered. "You've such quiet hands," she murmured. Grace looked up, eyes wide. "Quiet hands don't make trouble." "Maybe not," Catherine said, her voice low, "but they make memory." The words frightened them both. They pretended they hadn't been spoken, but silence, once broken, can never fully heal. Outside, Riverwood's crops thickened under the relentless Sunday. Inside, a different kind of growth was taking place, unspoken, unpermitted, but alive nonetheless. When Catherine lay in bed at night, she found herself listening for Grace's footsteps in the corridor. the faint, rhythmic sound that meant morning would come and the house would breathe again. And when Grace prayed in the dark, her prayer changed. No longer just, "Let them see what they expect." Now, a whisper followed it. "Let her see me, even if she never knows why." Somewhere beyond the fields, thunderclouds began to gather again. By midsummer, the Virginia air had turned syrup-thick, the kind of heat that blurs the edges of reason. At Riverwood, the days repeated themselves with the stubborn rhythm of machinery, meals, ledgers, chores, silence. Yet under that sameness, something unstable pulsed. Catherine no longer waited for afternoon to come. She counted toward it. Every day at 3, Grace would appear with a tray of tea and the next book in hand. They read less now and talked more, their voices weaving through the slow hours until the air between them felt charged. Sometimes Catherine reached for a page, and her hand brushed Grace's wrist. Both women froze, pretending it hadn't happened, and then pretended not to remember later. Pretending was becoming its own language. Dinah watched from the margins, her worry sharpening. She caught Grace once in the hallway and said, "You best mind your shadow, girl. The mistress don't know the rules of this place like we do, but the master does, and he writes 'em." Grace bowed her head. "Yes, ma'am." "Don't yes, ma'am me if you ain't listening. I seen how you look at her when you think nobody sees." Grace said nothing, but inside, panic beat like a trapped bird. The first tremor of disaster came quietly. It was a Sunday morning in early September. The house buzzed with the soft chaos of Sabbath preparations, ironing, polishing, the smell of cornbread drifting from the kitchen. Catherine came down late, pale and trembling. She managed a few sips of coffee before her face went gray. The cup slipped from her hand, shattering on the tile. Isaiah caught her just before she fell. "Patience," he barked. "Send for Dr. Kemp." Within hours, the young physician arrived, his boots still dusty from the road, his bag of instruments clicking faintly as he opened it in the master bedroom. Catherine lay on her side, dazed but conscious, while Grace stood near the window, hands clenched. Isaiah ordered her out, but Catherine's weak voice stopped him. "Let her stay." Kemp examined her gently, murmuring clinical reassurances. When he finished, he turned to Isaiah with the thin smile of a man delivering good news that might still ruin someone. "Mr. Vanderhorst," he said, "your wife is with child." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Outside, cicadas shrilled. Inside, the words hung like smoke. Isaiah blinked. "You're certain?" 8 weeks, perhaps 9, the doctor said. "A fine pulse, steady growth. With care, I see no reason for concern." Isaiah nodded slowly, dismissing Kemp with a handshake that felt colder than gratitude. When the doctor left, Isaiah remained by the window, pipe unlit, gaze unfocused. Patience found him there an hour later. "Congratulations, master," she said softly. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his ledger, flipped back through months of notes, and began counting. His last visit to Catherine's chamber had been the middle of July, 2 months ago, maybe more. He turned another page, as though arithmetic could lie more kindly than memory. That evening, Catherine lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The word pregnant throbbed in her head like a wound. She pressed a hand to her stomach. The gesture felt foreign, almost shameful. When Grace entered quietly to check on her, Catherine whispered, "They say I'm with child." Grace froze, candlelight trembling in her hand. "That's good news, mistress." "No," Catherine said, "it isn't." Grace set the candle down. "Why do you say that?" "Because it's impossible." Her voice broke into a whisper. "Isaiah hasn't touched me in months." Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. "You think the doctor is wrong?" Grace asked carefully. "I don't know what to think." Catherine's hand went again to her stomach, then to her forehead. "I feel sick all the time, but I know my body. I know what it means and what it doesn't." Grace lowered her eyes. "Sometimes the Lord makes things that don't fit our reckonings." Catherine turned sharply toward her. "Grace, you don't think—" She stopped herself, searching Grace's face for something she couldn't even define. The silence between them thickened until Catherine looked away, ashamed of the thought she hadn't dared to finish. Outside that room, Riverwood began to change. Isaiah's politeness became precision, every question, a probe, every glance, a measurement. He stopped smoking on the porch and started pacing, Patience, sensing danger in the air. instructed the staff to keep quiet and stay invisible. "When a master's mind turns inward," she warned, "don't let him see yours." Grace felt the tension pressing closer by the day. She could no longer hide in routine. Every task seemed observed. Her disguise, once armor, now felt like a noose. Each night she checked her bindings twice, then 3 times, terrified that her body might betray her in some unnoticed detail. When Catherine asked her to sleep on a pallet in the dressing room, "In case I'm sick during the night," she'd said, Grace obeyed without hesitation. But lying a few feet from her mistress's bed, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, Grace felt something deeper than fear, an ache that was equal parts tenderness and doom. In the morning, Isaiah announced that Dr. Kemp would return in 2 weeks to confirm the progress. His tone was steady, but his eyes told another story. Calculation. That night, he wrote to Thomas in Richmond. The letter began with pleasantries and ended with a question that was anything but casual. "Brother, remind me the Charleston girl you purchased in April. Did you see the documentation yourself? I seem to recall some irregularities. Send me the details when convenient." He sealed the letter, poured himself a drink, and stared at the darkened fields beyond the window. The tobacco swayed like a single living body under the moonlight, whispering secrets he could almost hear. Upstairs, Catherine dreamt of drowning, of trying to breathe through water that smelled faintly of tobacco and candle wax. She woke gasping, found Grace sitting awake beside the window, and whispered, "Are you afraid of storms?" Grace shook her head. "No, mistress." "Then what keeps you from sleep?" "Truth," Grace said quietly. "It comes whether you call for it or not." Catherine looked at her for a long time, then turned away. Neither woman said what they truly feared, that the child growing inside Catherine might already be that truth, coming to claim them both. Downstairs, Isaiah's candle still burned long past midnight. In its wavering light, his shadow stretched across the study wall, tall, distorted, waiting. October arrived with a strange quiet, the kind that doesn't soothe but listens. The fields were ready for harvest, the tobacco leaves drying in long sheds that smelled of earth and smoke. Yet at Riverwood, the air felt wrong, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Isaiah had become a watcher, not openly, not in a way that could be accused, but with the silent, analytical attention of a man reading invisible handwriting. He asked questions that sounded harmless. "How long does my wife rest in the afternoons? Who attends her when she does?" The servants answered carefully, each word chosen like stepping through a swamp. Patience noticed it first, the way Isaiah lingered near doors, how his eyes followed Grace when she crossed a room. "That man's thinking too much," she told Dinah one morning. And when a master starts thinking, somebody pays for it. Dinah's mouth tightened. "He's asking about the mistress's routine, about Grace." Patience sighed. "Then tell that girl to tread softer, or better yet, don't tread at all." But by then, it was too late for soft steps. Catherine's pregnancy advanced visibly. Her face thinned, her wrists turned fragile, but her belly swelled in defiance of her disbelief. The county physician, Dr. Kemp, came for his regular examination. He declared the child vigorous, his tone almost cheerful, though his eyes flickered with unease when Isaiah pressed him with questions about timing. 4 months, perhaps a bit more, the doctor said, adjusting his spectacles. Isaiah's brow furrowed, and conception would have occurred when, exactly? "Late June or early July," Kemp said. "Why do you ask?" Isaiah gave a small, polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. Curiosity, nothing more. When Kemp departed, Isaiah walked him to his carriage, and then stood on the drive long after the wheels had vanished, the letter from Thomas heavy in his pocket. Thomas's letter had arrived 3 days earlier. The handwriting was hurried, the tone uncharacteristically grave. "Isaiah, forgive my intrusion into your household matters, but I've uncovered something odd regarding that Charleston purchase. I encountered Samuel Pritchard, remember, the auctioneer, and when I mentioned Grace by name, he turned pale. I pressed the matter. It seems there were discrepancies in the paperwork. The physician listed, Dr. Marcus Waverley, never existed, and the bill of sale bears signs of alteration, the gender line, in particular. Pritchard called it a clarification for market value. I don't know what that means, but it troubled me enough to write." Isaiah had read those lines again and again, the words gender line glowing like embers beneath the ink. He didn't tell Catherine. Instead, he locked the letter in his desk, poured himself bourbon, and began to think like a man betrayed. At first, the suspicion had no shape. It was simply unease, his wife's pregnancy coming too soon after neglect, the slave girl's eerie grace, the hushed afternoons behind closed doors. But now, with Thomas's revelation, unease hardened into narrative. The mind, once given the scent of sin, will build an entire theology around it. He imagined the scenes, whispered talk, hands brushing, that deceptive tenderness that women called compassion. The thought made his stomach turn. He began following patterns like clues. Catherine retired earlier now, claiming fatigue. Grace no longer slept in the attic, but on a pallet in the dressing room. A practical arrangement, Catherine had said, in case of night sickness. Patience confirmed it without expression. Isaiah nodded at the explanation, but said nothing. That night, he stood in the corridor outside his wife's room long after the house had gone still. Behind the door, he heard two breaths, one slow, one quicker, and something else, an intimacy that had no place in that house. He didn't open the door, not yet. In the attic, Lily and Hannah whispered about the storm building below stairs. "The master's got that quiet rage," Lily said, "like a kettle waiting to blow." "Then best we all keep our heads low," Hannah answered. "He ain't looking to hear truth, he's looking to find guilt." Grace felt the pressure closing around her like a fist. Every time she passed Isaiah in a hallway, his gaze lingered a little too long. When he spoke her name, she could feel the weight of the question he hadn't yet asked. Catherine noticed the shift too. One evening, she caught Isaiah staring at her from the porch while she walked in the garden. "You're watching me," she said quietly when he joined her. He smiled without warmth. "I like to see what belongs to me." The words chilled her more than any accusation. That night, Catherine turned to Grace. "He knows something," she whispered. "I can feel it." Grace's hands trembled. "Then we must be careful." Catherine almost laughed, the sound brittle. "Careful? There's no careful left. I'm carrying proof of something I can't explain. The only question is when he decides to demand an answer." Grace wanted to say the truth, that the danger had always been there, waiting, the way fire waits in dry wood, but all she managed was, "He'll believe what he wants to believe." Catherine looked at her for a long moment. "And what do you believe, Grace?" Grace opened her mouth, then closed it. The truth had no safe language here. By late November, Isaiah's pretense of calm was gone. He began rising before dawn, prowling the house with a lantern, claiming to inspect the foundations for rot. Patience saw him once outside the storage room where Grace kept linens, his hand resting on the latch, his breath uneven. "You won't find peace in a locked door, master," she said softly. He startled, then composed himself. "No," he said, "but I might find truth." Patience shook her head. "Truth don't live in a man's anger. It hides from it." When he walked away, she exhaled a prayer for a mercy she doubted God would grant. December crept in with frost on the windows and smoke in the air. Isaiah received another letter from Thomas, a short one this time, confirming the worst. "The auctioneer admits the papers were altered. The slave sold as female may not be so. I advise caution and discretion." That was all Isaiah needed. The facts, the arithmetic, the timing, they clicked together with an awful certainty. He poured himself another drink, the amber liquid trembling in the glass. In the reflection of his study window, he saw his own face looking back, haunted, humiliated, vengeful. When morning came, his decision was already made. He sent a note to Dr. Kemp. "Your services are required at Riverwood immediately. The matter concerns one of my slaves and demands a thorough medical examination. Discretion essential." Grace received the summons just before noon. Patience delivered it, her hands shaking. "Child," she said, "listen to me. Whatever happens, keep your head bowed and your mouth shut." Grace's voice was almost calm. "I knew it would come." Patience's eyes filled. "Then pray it passes quick." Outside, the sky hung low and gray, full of snow that hadn't yet decided to fall. The house was silent except for Isaiah's footsteps pacing the downstairs hall, the measured rhythm of a man preparing to open hell itself. The sound reached Catherine as she sat in her room, unaware of the note sent, unaware that her world had already ended. She was stitching a small cloth for the child she hadn't wanted to believe was real. When she pricked her finger, a drop of blood welled bright against the white fabric. She watched it spread slowly, staining the shape of the tiny garment, and whispered, "Something's coming." Downstairs, Isaiah lit a candle, unlocked the door to the old sewing room, and waited for Dr. Kemp to arrive. The doctor arrived just after dusk. The last of the day's light clung to the fields like dying embers, and a cold wind chased him from his carriage to the porch. Isaiah greeted him with a handshake too firm to be friendly. Behind that grip was command, and behind command, rage. "Thank you for coming so promptly, Doctor," Isaiah said. "We have a matter that needs professional clarification." Kemp, uneasy but polite, nodded. "Is it Mrs. Vanderhorst again?" Isaiah's jaw tightened. "No, another member of the household, one whose paperwork seems to have been misleading." He led the physician through the hall without further explanation. Candlelight threw long shadows up the staircase. At the landing, they stopped outside a small storage room. From inside came the faint rustle of fabric and the sound of someone's breath, quick, uneven, waiting. Isaiah opened the door. Grace sat on a wooden chair, wrists bound in front with a thin cord that looked more ceremonial than necessary. She had been sitting there for an hour already, staring at the single candle on the table, trying not to think. "Dr. Kemp," Isaiah said evenly, "you may proceed." The physician's confusion flickered into dread. "I'm sorry, proceed with what, exactly?" "An examination. The truth about this one's sex has been misrepresented. I want certainty." Kemp hesitated, glancing from Isaiah's cold expression to Grace's motionless form. "Sir, I am not accustomed to—" Isaiah's voice cut through him. "You are accustomed to medicine, are you not? Then you will examine and confirm." Grace did not beg. She did not even speak. She looked at the doctor the way one looks at the executioner, seeing not the man, but the office he occupies. "Mr. Vanderhorst," Kemp began, but Isaiah stepped forward, his eyes burning. "She was bought as a girl. She walks this house as a girl. But the truth—" His voice trembled between fury and humiliation. "The truth has made a fool of me. I will not be fooled again." He shoved the physician's bag toward the table. "Do your work." The room was small, windowless, the air stifling. Kemp set down his instruments with shaking hands. He turned to Grace. "Miss, forgive me, I don't—" Grace met his eyes for the first time. "Do what you came to do, Doctor. I've lived on borrowed time long enough." She rose slowly, the bindings around her chest pressed like bands of iron. With steady fingers, she began unfastening them. Layer by layer, illusion gave way to flesh. The silence in the room deepened until it felt like prayer. When the last strip of cloth fell, no one breathed. The candle flickered once and steadied. Isaiah stared, his face collapsing into something beyond comprehension, rage, revulsion, and the hollow grief of a man realizing that everything he owned had conspired to make him small. Kemp looked away. "Mr. Vanderhorst," he said quietly, "there is no need for violence. This person has deceived you, yes, but—" Isaiah struck the table so hard the candle jumped. "This creature has brought ruin into my house. My wife, my name. Do you understand what's been done here?" Grace stood upright, naked but unbowed. "You ruin yourself," she said softly. "You always did." The words landed like a whip. Isaiah lunged forward. His hand caught her by the throat, slammed her against the wall. The candle toppled, flame licking across the floorboards, before Kemp stamped it out with his boot. "Master, please." Patience's voice burst from the doorway she had come, despite knowing better. "Don't damn your soul further." Isaiah froze, his hand still gripping Grace's neck. Grace did not fight. Her eyes held his, calm and terrible, the way still water holds the image of the sky. Slowly, his fingers loosened. He stepped back, breathing hard, trembling with the effort of not destroying what stood before him. "Lock her up," he said finally. "In the smokehouse. No food, no visitors. Tomorrow we'll decide what to do with her." Patience obeyed, her face gray. Kemp gathered his things, shaken to silence. Before he left, he looked once at Grace. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She nodded. "You will be." The smokehouse stood 50 yards behind the main kitchen, a square of brick, low-ceilinged, reeking of salt and memory. Patience led Grace there by lantern light. The night was cold, the air thick with the smell of tobacco curing in the distance. Inside, Grace sat on the floor, her wrists unbound now, her body trembling from exhaustion. Patience knelt beside her and covered her shoulders with an old shawl. "Child," she murmured, "why didn't you run?" Grace smiled faintly. "Run where? There's nowhere left for what I am." Patience's eyes glistened. "What you are is God's own making. Ain't no sin in being born different." Grace shook her head. "Then why does the world treat it like one?" Patience had no answer. She pressed the shawl closer. "I'll bring you water come morning if I can." As the door closed, the darkness folded around Grace like a shroud. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to weep, not from fear, but from release. The secret was over. The mask was gone. Whatever came next would come honestly. Upstairs, Catherine woke to silence and absence. Grace's pallet in the dressing room was empty. On the floor lay one of her bindings, torn. Catherine's blood ran cold. She dressed quickly and went in search of Isaiah. She found him in his study, staring into the dying fire. "Where is she?" Catherine demanded. He didn't look up. Contained. "What have you done?" "I discovered what you brought into my house." "I brought nothing." Isaiah stood, his face a ruin of fury. "Don't lie to me. That thing you kept in your chamber, that you let touch you." Catherine's voice trembled but didn't falter. "She's not a thing. She's not even a woman. She's more human than you'll ever be." The words struck like a slap. For a moment, Isaiah just stared at her, as if the room itself had betrayed him. Then he spoke, low and venomous. "You've shamed this family beyond forgiveness." Catherine stepped closer, trembling. "If you harm her, Isaiah, you'll lose what little is left of your soul." He leaned forward, his voice a whisper. "I lost that, the day I let you into this house." She left the room shaking, knowing then that whatever justice Grace would find, it would not come from men. By morning, word had spread quietly among the servants. They moved through their tasks with the stillness of people rehearsing survival. Patience made her way back to the smokehouse before dawn, carrying a crust of bread and a tin cup of water. When she opened the door, the lantern light fell across Grace's face, pale, tear-streaked, but alive. "Hold on," Patience said. "You hear me? Hold on." Grace nodded. "Tell her I don't blame her," she whispered. "I will." As Patience slipped out again, the first light of dawn broke over Riverwood. In the kitchen yard, frost glimmered on the grass like glass shards. Somewhere in the house, Isaiah's footsteps began again, measured, relentless, moving toward the decision he'd promised himself he'd make today. And upstairs, Catherine sank to her knees beside the cradle she'd been sewing for the child she no longer understood, whispering the same word again and again until it lost its meaning. "Grace." The morning was brittle and white with frost when the servants gathered in uneasy silence. Even the mules were restless. Smoke rose thin and grey from the chimneys, and the light that reached Riverwood seemed cold enough to cut. By the time the bell rang for breakfast, Isaiah Vanderhorst had already decided. The household filed into the hall with the dull obedience of those who know the day will not end kindly. Catherine came last. She moved like someone walking through a dream, her face pale, her eyes raw from a night without sleep. Isaiah stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back. His composure was worse than anger. It had the quiet gravity of judgment already delivered. "Grace," he said. The word came out like a sentence. Patience appeared in the doorway, guiding Grace forward. She had washed her face, combed her hair, and given her the decency of a shawl, though it hung loosely over her thin frame. She did not look at anyone except Catherine. Isaiah spoke evenly. "You have deceived this house and disgraced my name. You will answer for it before God and before those whose trust you violated." Grace's voice was steady. "I deceived no one who wasn't already living by a lie." A ripple went through the servants. Isaiah's jaw tightened. "You mock me even now." "No," she said. "I pity you." Patience whispered a prayer under her breath. Isaiah gestured toward Dr. Kemp, who stood off to the side, pale and uncomfortable. "You will bear witness, Doctor. You saw the proof. There is no question of what stands before us." Kemp's eyes darted between them. "I saw a person, Mr. Vanderhorst. Whatever else you wish to call her, that's between you and your conscience." Isaiah's face darkened. "My conscience is clear. This creature entered my household under false pretenses. For that, there must be punishment." "Punishment," Catherine said sharply, "for surviving in a world that wouldn't let her exist." Isaiah turned on her. "You defend her still." "I defend what's human in her and what's been dying in you." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a thunderclap. Isaiah straightened. Enough. She will be taken to the jail in Hanover. The magistrate will decide her fate. I've written the charges: fraud, impersonation, and moral corruption. She'll be transported tomorrow at first light. Catherine stepped forward. You'll destroy her. She destroyed herself. No, Catherine's voice cracked. You did. For the first time since the night before, Grace spoke directly to him. You think you're saving your name, she said quietly, but all you're doing is carving your sin into history where it can't be buried. Isaiah's hand twitched toward his belt, then fell. He turned away, unable to look at her. Take her back to the smokehouse, he said. She'll be moved in the morning. Patience hesitated, but Catherine's glance stopped her. The two women shared a silent understanding, one built not of words, but of will. That night, when the house had gone still and the frost had begun to creep up the window panes, Catherine slipped out of her room. She moved barefoot, carrying only a shawl and a small bundle of food. The corridor seemed endless. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot. At the back door, she found Patience waiting, a lantern in hand. The old woman didn't ask questions. You'll need the stable key, she said softly. The back gate's loose on the left hinge. It'll let her through. Catherine gripped her hand. If he finds out, he will, Patience said, but he'll have to live with it. I've lived with worse. The smokehouse door opened without a sound. Grace was awake, sitting in the same place as before, her knees drawn up beneath the shawl. When she saw Catherine, she rose slowly, disbelief flickering across her face. You shouldn't be here, Grace whispered. I can't let him hand you over like property, Catherine said. There's a wagon path through the pines. Follow it north until you reach the creek. There's a free settlement near Petersburg. Tell them you came from me. They'll hide you. Grace stared at her, then at the bundle in her hands. You'd risk everything. I already lost everything, Catherine said. Except you. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved outside, carrying the smell of cold iron and distant smoke. Then Grace reached out and touched Catherine's face lightly, as one might touch something sacred. If there's another world, she said, I hope it's kind to women like us. Catherine's eyes filled. Go. Grace slipped into the dark. The shawl trailed behind her like a ghost as she vanished into the pines. By dawn, Isaiah discovered the door ajar and the smokehouse empty. His roar woke the entire plantation. Men were sent in every direction, horses saddled, bloodhounds released. Catherine stood at the window, watching the search begin. When Isaiah stormed into her room, she didn't turn. You did this, he spat. You freed that abomination. Yes, she said simply. He stepped toward her, trembling with fury. Do you know what you've done to me? Catherine faced him at last. I know what you've done to yourself. His hand raised halfway, then fell. He stared at her belly, rounded now beneath her nightdress. And that thing inside you, he whispered, is it hers? Catherine held his gaze, her voice quiet and unyielding. It's mine. He left without another word. 3 days later, Grace was found near the creek, half-starved, her feet torn raw from frost and stone. The patrol brought her back in chains. Isaiah said nothing when they laid her at his feet. That night, without ceremony, he ordered her sold south to Louisiana, to the sugar fields where people rarely lasted long enough to be remembered. The papers were signed by morning. When the wagon departed, Catherine watched from the window, one hand pressed to the glass. Grace never looked back. Months passed. Catherine bore the child in silence, a girl, small and fragile, with eyes the color of old amber. She named her Mercy. Isaiah refused to acknowledge her. Within a year, Catherine was sent to Charleston for her health. She never returned. Patience buried the news quietly. Grace died in Louisiana 2 years later. Catherine's daughter was adopted by distant cousins. Isaiah lived another decade, alone in the house he had damned with his own hand. Years afterward, when Riverwood fell into ruin and its ledgers were found in a trunk, one entry remained scorched at the edges. Lot 47 Grace, purchased the 14th of April 1847. Status, returned to God. And beneath it, written in a woman's hand, faint and trembling, not returned, Tarkan. The years that followed turned Riverwood into a place of echoes. The laughter of children never came. The tobacco fields went fallow. Shutters hung crooked and unpainted. The house, once proud, began to decay, as if mirroring its master's spirit. Isaiah lived there like a ghost among his own possessions. He rarely left his study except to walk the porch at dusk, staring at the horizon as though expecting someone to return from it. Servants came and went, whispering about the curse that had fallen on the Vanderhorst name. They said the air around Riverwood had changed, that no bird would nest in the eaves, that dogs howled before dawn, as if mourning something unseen. Patience remained the longest. She moved through the empty rooms with slow dignity, dusting furniture no one used, keeping alive the rhythm of order in a house that no longer had purpose. She sometimes caught Isaiah staring at her with hollow eyes, as if trying to remember what her name was. One evening, she found him standing by the cold fireplace, a glass in hand. "You still keeping her room clean?" he asked suddenly. Patience hesitated. "Whose room, master?" He gave a short, mirthless laugh. "You know whose." Patience set down the tray she carried. "It's closed up, same as you told me." He nodded, then whispered, "Good, keep it that way." That night, when the house was silent, Isaiah went upstairs and stood outside Catherine's locked chamber. Dust had settled thick on the handle, the smell of cedar and decay filling the corridor. He reached out, but his hand hovered, unable to turn the knob. Then, with a shudder, he walked away. In Charleston, Catherine endured her own exile in her mother-in-law Constance's rigid house. Constance, ever proper, treated her like a fallen relic, something to be displayed only when necessary. "You'll redeem yourself through silence," the older woman told her. Catherine obeyed outwardly, but inwardly she was unraveling. She wrote letters. She never sent one to Grace, one to Patience, one to the child taken from her arms. She kept them hidden beneath the floorboard, written in a hand that grew shakier with every passing month. Her daughter, Mercy, was adopted out under another name. Catherine was allowed to see her only once from a distance, when the couple who'd taken the child visited Charleston to thank Constance for her generosity. The girl, barely walking, had Grace's dark eyes. Catherine stood behind a curtain and wept soundlessly until her throat ached. In the spring of 1856, word reached Charleston that Isaiah Vanderhorst had collapsed while walking the fields. The letter was brief. Heart failure. Catherine received it with dry eyes. She folded the paper, placed it beside Grace's old Bible, and whispered, "So the house died before the man did." Riverwood passed to a distant cousin. Catherine was left a small inheritance enough to live quietly in Richmond. She rented a modest room near the James River and lived there for the next 15 years, alone, writing her thoughts into notebooks that no one ever read. Neighbors described her as polite but distant, a woman who attended church regularly, yet seemed untouched by its comfort. Children called her the widow with the haunted eyes. Once a week, she walked to the river's edge, sat on a bench, and read from the same small Bible. Between its pages, she had pressed a scrap of cloth from Grace's shawl. The color had long since faded, but the scent of smoke and magnolia lingered. When the Civil War came, Riverwood was abandoned. Union troops camped briefly on its grounds, mistaking the plantation for unoccupied property. They left graffiti on the parlor walls, names, dates, the outline of a hand. A fire in 1864 burned half the main house. Locals said it was struck by lightning. Others said the ghosts were tired of waiting. In 1871, Catherine died quietly in her sleep. Her landlady found her the next morning, the Bible open on her chest, one hand resting on a folded letter addressed only, "To the child of Riverwood, wherever you are." The coroner listed her death as natural causes. She was buried in an unmarked grave at Shockoe Hill Cemetery, beside dozens of forgotten women whose names had faded from the stones. But stories have a way of surviving what facts cannot. In 1891, when Riverwood's remains were finally cleared to make way for timbering, workers unearthed a small iron box beneath what had been the parlor floor. Inside were two things: a lock of dark hair tied with blue thread and a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle, written in a woman's hand. It read, "Her name was Grace. She lived as the world allowed her to, and died for what the world refused to understand. If anyone ever finds this, let her be remembered not for what she was called, but for who she was. The only person who ever saw me without judgment. C.V." No one claimed the box. It was sent to the Hanover County Archives and mislabeled as miscellaneous correspondence, 1,000 840 seconds, 1,850 seconds. By the 1,920 seconds, a historian named Edwin Pritchard, no relation to the auctioneer, found references to a domestic scandal at Riverwood Plantation involving a disputed slave identity. The documents were fragmentary, fire-damaged, and half the names illegible. He published a single paragraph about it in a local journal, dismissing it as likely exaggerated gossip. And yet, in his personal notebook, found after his death, Pritchard had scrawled a line that never appeared in print. Something about the papers felt alive, as if they'd been waiting for someone to look long enough to see the truth. Today, only the foundation stones of Riverwood remain moss-covered outlines of rooms where love, cruelty, and silence once lived side by side. Travelers who wander through Hanover's woods sometimes report hearing faint music near the ruins, or the whisper of a woman's voice reading poetry in the wind. Locals call her the Reader of Riverwood. No one knows whether it's Catherine's ghost or Grace's, perhaps both. The last trace of Riverwood Plantation faded from the maps in 1904, when the county formally dissolved the estate's boundaries and sold the land to a timber company. Yet, long after its name disappeared from the deeds, stories continued to cling to the soil like tobacco ash. Old farmers spoke of tools vanishing near the ruins, only to be found later laid neatly beside the creek, as if returned by unseen hands. Children dared each other to approach the broken stones after sunset. They swore they heard footsteps pacing inside the empty outline of what had been the main house, a woman's whisper mingling with the wind. A few called it superstition. Others said the ground simply remembered. In 1928, a young archivist named Helen Mercer arrived at the South Carolina Historical Society to assist in cataloging plantation ledgers. Among the boxes transferred from Hanover County was a leather-bound volume with a warped spine. The title embossed in flaking gold read, Riverwood Accounts, 1,846, 1,848. Inside, Mercer found something that shouldn't have been there, a folded envelope pressed between tobacco sales tallies. The ink had turned sepia with age. Across the front, in a graceful hand, it read, For whoever seeks truth, not comfort. Inside was a single page written on thick rag paper. To remember is to resist erasure. I was called Grace. I lived as I could. I loved as I dared. They took my name, but not my story. If you read this, know that I was real. At the bottom, faint but legible, were two initials, G.V. Mercer, curious, traced the lineage of the Vanderhorst family and discovered Catherine's correspondence in the Richmond archives. The handwriting matched, one written by Catherine, the other she could not tell. It was as though two lives had written together, indistinguishable in grief. She published her findings in a 1931 issue of the Virginia Genealogical Review under the title, The Vanished Tribunal of 1,847, Fragments from Riverwood. The article attracted little attention. It was too strange, too uncomfortable. Plantation owners didn't want to hear about a mistress and a slave bound by forbidden love. Historians dismissed it as romantic speculation, but Mercer didn't stop. She visited Louisiana in 1933, following records of a plantation fire near Baton Rouge, dated 1,848. There, among charred ledgers, she found an entry written in a foreman's scrawl. Arrival, one servant from Virginia, named Grace. Died August 3, exhaustion. In the margin, someone else had written, in delicate script, not dead, freed by fire. Mercer took a rubbing of the page. She kept it framed above her desk until her death in 1972. When her papers were donated to the Historical Society, the curators found a note tucked behind the glass. Perhaps the ghost at Riverwood isn't haunting, it's remembering. A century later, the story resurfaced. A documentary crew filming near Hanover stumbled upon the overgrown foundation of Riverwood while mapping Civil War sites. Local historian Mary Ellis recognized the name from Mercer's article and began to investigate. Her documentary, The Sealed Report, premiered in 2019. It pieced together the fragments, the forged bill of sale, Dr. Kemp's missing ledger, Catherine's unsent letters, and reignited a question that had slept for 170 years. What really happened at Riverwood? During the filming, Ellis interviewed descendants of both the Vanderhorsts and the enslaved families who once lived on the estate. One elderly woman, a descendant of Patience, recalled a family story passed down through generations. Miss Catherine tried to save her. She opened the door herself. They say the girl didn't die in Louisiana. They say she walked north under another name, with a scar across her cheek and a Bible in her hand. Ellis smiled when she heard it. "And do you believe that story?" she asked. The woman's eyes gleamed. "Doesn't matter if I believe, the land does." In the film's closing shot, the camera drifts across the ruins at twilight. Fireflies rise from the grass like scattered souls. Over the faint hum of crickets, a woman's voice, Ellis's own, reads the final lines from Catherine's recovered letter. "Grace and I were born into a world that had no language for what we were, so we created one in silence. If history ever finds us, let it say we were two people who refused to vanish quietly." The screen fades to black. Today, if you visit the site where Riverwood once stood, there's a marker erected in 2022 by the Virginia Historical Commission. It reads simply, "Riverwood Plantation, 1798, 1891. Site of an 1847 domestic tribunal whose sealed records, uncovered in the 20th century, revealed the forbidden love between Catherine Vanderhorst, mistress of the estate, and Grace, a formerly enslaved person of intersex identity. Both women were condemned by their time. Their story, pieced together from letters and ledgers, stands as testament to what history tried to erase. Visitors leave tokens there, ribbons, handwritten notes, fragments of blue cloth. Some swear that on humid summer evenings, if you stand among the stones and listen closely, you can hear a woman reading aloud, her voice soft but clear lines of poetry no one has yet traced to any known author. And sometimes, when the wind shifts, another voice answers. The Riverwood story ends where most of history's great loves end, not with triumph, but with remembrance. Yet in the remembering, something miraculous survives. Defiance. Defiance against the cruelty of law, against the arrogance of ownership, against the silence of archives. Grace's final words, "I lived as I could, I loved as I dared," outlasted the men who condemned her, because some truths, once spoken, refused to die.